Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 40th Annual Tufts University Institute for Global Leadership Symposium on Risk and Resilience and Uncertainties. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our panel, The Hollow Global Order, The Illusion of Stability. My name is Alejandro Alvarez Acuña. I'm an undergraduate student pursuing an International Relations and Peace and Justice Studies degree, and I am a member of the student organizing committee for this year's symposium. I'm joined also by my fellow panel coordinator and good friend, Bruno Ricketts, majoring in international relations with a concentration in international economics. It is truly a privilege for both of us to moderate tonight's conversation. The 20th century was defined by the ambition to build a cooperative global order, an architecture of institutions designed to anchor peace, coordinate sovereign states, and replace coercion with sure rules. Yet today, that order appears increasingly strained. Multilateral forums face recurring deadlock, compliance with global norms is uneven, and skepticism about institutional effectiveness and legitimacy is growing. And yet, the question before us is not simply whether the system is failing. Instead, it is whether we are witnessing structural collapse, cyclical stress, or a period of transformation. Are the fractures in global governance evidence of an inherent limitation, perhaps an inability of institutions to overcome the absence of centralized authority? Or are they symptoms of adaptation in a changing geopolitical landscape? Perhaps the narrative of crisis itself obscures the quieter endurance of institutions that continue to function, negotiate, and deliver.
We chose this theme for the Risk and Resilience Symposium because resilience in our current context extends beyond just conflict. Rather, resilience is also about whether institutional frameworks that structure global cooperation can withstand contestation, rivalry, and shifting power dynamics. Tonight, we interrogate whether the future of global order is hollow or whether it is evolving. Each of our panelists will begin with opening remarks to outline their perspective. After those statements, we will pose several questions to spark conversation. We will then open the floor to audience questions. When we do, we invite you to approach the microphone, briefly identify yourself, and preferably direct your question to one panelist in particular.
To begin, it is my pleasure to introduce Mauricio Artiñano. Mauricio Artiñano is a foreign affairs and diplomacy specialist with a focus on the United Nations, UN peace operations, multilateral governance, and democracy. He is a Costa Rican diplomat in 2008-2009, and Costa Rica served as elected member of the United Nations Security Council, and was the youngest even political coordinator for the UN Security Council member. He then served in UN peace operations in South Sudan, Somalia, and Colombia, where he supported the implementation of the Colombian Final Peace Agreement. Mauricio is currently engaged with Costa Rican civil society initiatives to strengthen democratic governance and civic participation, and also serves as a senior advisor with the Starling Institute, a Think and Do tank, focused on renewing global governance. Mauricio graduated from Tufts University 20 years ago and was a Tisch Scholar for Citizenship and Public Service, and also involved with the Institute for Global Leadership. He also holds a Master in Public Affairs from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. Mauricio, take that forward.
Thank you, Alejandro. I have to begin by saying how happy and humbled I am to be here. 22 years ago, I was here for there I am. That was 22 years ago when I had the honor of presenting Joseph Nye with a Rita Maria Award. And I have to say that things seem coming full circle. Alejandro, fellow Costa Rican, now sophomore here at Tufts. Professor Deval was in our symposium. Professor Trachtman was my professor in international law class. Rita's a good friend, so I'm just really happy to be part of this panel and in this auditorium. I'm very grateful to Heather. Where is she? Where's Heather? There she is, who has been instrumental in my academic and professional career. So that was me moderating my panel. That was me moving around in someone else's panel. And back then, in 2005, we had a tradition where we raised the United Nations flag here at Tufts. And as you can see from those headlines from the Tufts Daily, some students got upset. They didn't like that. And so it was kind of a big deal, UN Day that year. And I had to give a speech, and I pulled it out yesterday, and I was surprised and happy to say that I could deliver that speech today and not change a word, and it still resonates. And I want to read one part of that speech. So this is what I said back then. We must remember an important point that often seems lost by the UN's detractors. which is that the UN is merely a reflection of the actions and wishes of its members. By providing a table for governments to sit down together and discuss, the UN is performing an invaluable service to the world. And if we want to criticize the UN, it would do us well to look both at the characteristics of this table, but more so on the attitudes of the government sitting around it. That was also a time when multilateralism was in crisis. Europe was in crisis. Europe was split up internally. What was happening at that time? France and Germany joined Russia and China in scuttling US efforts to gain Security Council approval for the US and UK approval for the intervention in Iraq. And we gathered here in this auditorium and we talked about multilateralism being in crisis. Multilateralism is apparently in crisis today again. And what Alejandro asked, I guess I have to agree with your question about whether the narrative of the crisis of global governance is obscuring the resilience of international institutions. Because back then and today also, the UN remains an indispensable organization that provides a service to humanity that no one else does, because it's one body where 193 member states meet to talk, to discuss. Then the Secretariat is asked to implement some of these mandates. We all know, I don't have to tell you all of the architecture of the UN, but the UN remains indispensable. That's one of the arguments that I want to make today, especially when we think about whether relations between states evolve. And today what we're seeing is that in the middle of this supposed environment of crisis, and I don't mean to understate that, but I have to say that we don't really realize, we don't look at everything that's actually working. Rita's going to talk to you about an example of a coalition that exists between states that banded together to accomplish something that's really important. These kinds of coalitions, ad hoc coalitions, happen all the time, but we don't talk about them or we don't hear about them. And I want to ask you guys something. What do you think about these two memes? Every time there's a crisis, my friends send me these because they know I'm very proud of having served in the UN. And look at how, the UN is a giant punching bag. Why? Because everyone takes a hit at the UN, but part of the mandate of the UN is we can't really defend ourselves. I still talk about we, even though I'm not there, because I really believe in our organization. And when I see things like this, I ask myself certain things. And I'll start with this. How many of you have heard of the Srebrenica massacre? Okay, so in the middle of the Balkans War, 8,000 men and boys were massacred over 5 days, right? How many of you have heard of the massacres that occurred that same year in Macedonia? Really? Are you sure? They didn't happen. The Security Council approved the deployment of the UN Preventive Deployment, UNPRED. And you talk to experts and they'll tell you, analysts, that if UNPRED hadn't been deployed in the border between Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, the war would have probably spilled over. And speaking of spilling over, how many of you have heard of the Exxon Valdez oil spill? Yep. What about the oil spill off the coast of Yemen a few years ago, the FS Safar ship? It didn't happen either. Okay? It would have been the 5th largest oil spill in history. But it didn't happen because the UN Secretary General managed to get a group of member states to help remove, I don't know how many barrels of oil from this ship that's stranded off the coast of Yemen. Let's go a little bit, not in the realm of the environment. In March 2011, the post-electoral violence in Cote d'Ivoire, many people credit the UN, so the Security Council through Resolution 1975 authorized the UN peacekeeping operation in Cote d'Ivoire, UNOSI, to use attack helicopters to prevent the forces of outgoing president, who he claimed he won the election, Laurent Gbagbo, Professor Deval will be able to pronounce this, Gbagbo, so the UN intervened to help protect civilians. And finally, this is where I just keep hearing people saying that the UN isn't doing anything about Ukraine. Do some of you agree with that? How many of you have heard of the Black Sea Grain Initiative? Okay, a few of you. So this is, I think, May 2022. If you see that Secretary General Guterres, that's the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and those are two diplomats from Ukraine and Russia. Doesn't that seem weird to have these people together in May 2022? Well, the Secretary General managed to negotiate what became the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and for 1 year, diplomats and people in charge of navigation and all those more technical issues from Ukraine, Russia, the United Nations, and Turkey were in the same building in Istanbul coordinating for ships to go in and out of the Black Sea. Look at how many tons of grain were exported. Many people credit the Black Sea Grain Initiative for stabilizing global food prices. Most of those grains went to developing countries. And look how few people have heard about it. So all of this is to make the point that when the UN works, when multilateralism works, we don't hear about it. And that's really sad. But partly it's because when things don't happen, they're not the news. I don't have any evidence to prove that UNPREDEV helped prevent a war in Macedonia because it didn't happen. And that's an issue that the UN faces all the time. So whenever I talk about this, I quote Christopher Nolan in his movie Tenet. He has a line that I feel could have been written for the UN. And what it says is, I'll read it. We're the people saving the world from what might have been. The world will never know what could happen, and even if they did, they wouldn't care. Because no one cares about the bomb that didn't go off, only the one that did. And again, multilateralism might seem like it's in crisis, but if you look just a little bit closer, you'll find things like the Hand Vision Coalition that Rita's going to talk about. So yes, relations between member states will wax and wane, and and right now certainly it's a tough time, but the UN endures. The UN is indispensable, and as you see, when multilateralism works, and it works a lot of the time, we simply don't know about it. So it's hard to give credit to the UN, but just look closer, and you'll see just how much the UN and multilateralism in general helps accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we are very honored to welcome Professor Joel P. Trachtman. Joel P. Trachtman is Emeritus Professor of International Law and Henry Breker Professor of Commercial Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. The author of 7 books, editor of 5 books, and author of over 80 academic articles and 55 scholarly chapters on international law. He has served as a member of the boards of the American Journal of International Law, the European Journal of International Law, and the Journal of International Economic Law. Off to you, Professor.
Thank you, Bruno, and thanks to Emma and Alejandro and Heather and all the other organizers for this. It's always tempting to argue with the title of your panel, and in a way, Mauricio has started to do that, to say the global order is not so hollow. It's half full. A late and great professor of international law from Columbia University, Louis Hankin, said most states comply with most international law most of the time. If I take most as 60%, then compliance is only 25% or less. So we have to think about the statistics and what is hollow and what is not. I've recently been working on a project to suggest ways to harness the trade system for greater achievement of sustainable development. And in that project, I've observed that the glass is kind of half full, that we don't have the institutions that we need to produce the rules that we need. And so I want to say it's hollow in some ways and it's full in other ways. And right now, at this particular historical moment, the liberal international order seems to be unstable. So, so this is a cartoon from newspapers as I was growing up. It was kind of old then. Pogo, it's a possum. And one of the titles of the books of Pogo cartoons is "We have met the enemy and he is us." And it's similar to what Mauricio was saying, that the states are in charge at the World Trade Organization. We always say it's a member organization. Nothing happens without the members. And each member can block every initiative unilaterally. Each member has a veto. And that means that my project for harnessing the trade system for sustainable development is always going to fail because someone is going to block it. And that problem is multiplied in a way because most sustainable development and trade issues are multifunctional issues that come under the jurisdiction of multiple international organizations. So there are possibilities for vetoes at all of those places. So we're talking about order. And there can be good order and bad order, and sometimes we fear order. But the causes of order are related to human nature. In international law, we think a lot about custom, norms, which are informal rules, and law, specific law. And as we've said, it depends on us. The international legal order has as its core principle pacta sunt servanda. The idea that if you make an agreement, and mostly today we're talking about treaties as opposed to customary international law, you abide by that agreement, you comply with that agreement. It's voluntary in the first place, but then you have to comply. And that norm seems to be violated quite a bit. We can talk about statistics. My colleague here, Michael Glennon, says that norm, the norm that's in my second bullet point of the prohibition on the use of force in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, he says it's fallen into desuetude by custom, by the fact that states don't follow. And we see that currently in Ukraine, Venezuela, possibly Cuba, Iran already, and possibly again, Taiwan, etc. And the United Nations was an act of hope. And we can say that it came out of a cataclysm as the League of Nations, after the First World War, came out of a cataclysm. That League of Nations didn't persist. It failed, and it failed to do what it was supposed to do. By the way, the court of the League of Nations was called the Permanent Court of International Justice. If you're ever in power, never name anything permanent, because it's almost a challenge to the fates that it will not be permanent. So we see cataclysm, response, and then I think in the case of the League of Nations perhaps, and maybe also in the case of the United Nations, fading historical memory, fading allegiance, fading ideas about what's right and what's wrong. And as Santayana said, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat. I want to say a couple of words about the trade order, which has been, since 1995, when the World Trade Organization was formed, a good example of strong international law, where you have mandatory dispute settlement, remedies, and pretty good compliance. Before that, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State in the United States in the 1930s and 40s, believed that trade was important to peace. And he believed that partly because Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in response to trade sanctions that the United States imposed on Japan. We also have order in this field, I think, growing because of knowledge, because of understanding, economic knowledge. John Maynard Keynes, who, along with Cordell Hull, brought about much of the Bretton Woods institutional development, said that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And what he meant was mercantilism, the idea that imports are bad and exports are good. We want to get more gold, maybe for military purposes, but not for other kinds of human welfare purposes. The WTO and its predecessor organization, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, brought about a reduction of tariffs that was stunning, that increased human welfare with distributional problems, but increased human welfare around the world to a great extent and assisted development. But it's been challenged greatly recently by, mostly by President Trump and the United States under his administration. Prime Minister Carney of Canada at Davos a couple of weeks ago talked about the fact that integration causes risks, and this is part of the concerns of this conference. He was referring to weaponized interdependence, the idea that Canada specifically had integrated so much with the United States that it was vulnerable to United States misbehavior. But what he didn't talk about, and what we were concerned about in this Remaking Trade project, and it applies to all sorts of things, is the fact that you have commercial integration without dealing with some of the technological and economic externalities that have attended the same growth that that economic integration has caused. So the WTO trade order from 1995 till today, and it's very vulnerable at the moment, started to have more specific rules and stronger dispute settlements. The United States was upset with some of the decisions, justifiably so, in my opinion, in some of the cases, and defected from the selection of members of the court, the appellate body, such that that court stopped operating and WTO law became unenforceable in judicial or formal terms. And of course, the Trump administration today is really violating that pacta sunt servanda principle, promiscuous in lots of ways, but in this context, in imposing tariffs that are not permitted and taking other kinds of actions. Some of it based on the pretext of a security exception in the treaties themselves. So, so what causes stability? We're talking about risk and instability. I think what causes stability, and one might start to be a conservative in a small c way and say, maybe some of the things we've developed in the past over time are worth considering as having some value that historically, or people in the past might have identified. So knowledge, education, ideas, and national politics are critical to stability. There are bad ideas that can become stable. We can have inefficient equilibria. And bad ideas can propagate. And we see some of that going on in Europe and other places today. But it's also true, and here the glass is half empty, that other states, in response to the United States actions, have identified their agency, have realized that they do have power, especially if they work together. And they have come to believe, to some extent, in that liberal world order and are working at the World Trade Organization, in other places, to preserve it. And so we might say that there's risk, but there's also resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Trachtman. I am honored to introduce our third panelist now, Professor Alex Zaghloul. Professor Alex Zaghloul is Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He has been a leading scholar, practitioner, and advocate on peace and security in Africa, widely recognized for framing mass starvation as a crime and for theorizing the concept of geokleptocracy. Back to you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here, and to be part of this small part of IGIL, which I think is one of the best things about this university. So, well done to all of you and to those of you here. There are many alums of IGL who have gone on to do absolutely astonishing things. So let me just briefly explain my thesis then. Geokleptocracy has swallowed geopolitics. And kleptocracy is normally conventionally seen as the rule of thieves. I think it's a bit more interesting, and I'll come on to that. And there are a lot of countries in the world where corruption is systemic. You see it everywhere. But what I try and capture with this idea of geokleptocracy is actually two things. One is that we have a global kleptocratic system. And secondly, it's not just about people stealing. It's not just about that 8 or 10 or 12% of the world's assets, wealth that disappears into secrecy jurisdictions, islands in the Caribbean, where maybe some other nasty things go on as well. It's actually taking control of politics, and actually part of the puzzle that the geo-strategic puzzle that we have today, I think, can be solved if we look at things through the kleptocratic lens. So my starting point is actually where I spent a lot of time in Sudan, involved in mediation activities, hanging out with the securists, the militia commanders, the intelligence bosses, and the money men. A very disreputable bunch, but a very skillful bunch, and learning their political vernacular. And they have a very simple set of operating rules for how politics runs in a transactional system, where institutions have failed or haven't been built. And it revolves around, basically three concepts. One is what they call the political budget. That's the money you have in your pocket that you use to buy political services, public office, personal allegiances, or even if you have enough of it, sovereignty, or parts of sovereignty, and slice and dice sovereignty. And this is, for example, what we see some of the Arab states doing in their interactions in Yemen and the war of Africa, slicing, dicing, trading and grading sovereignty, in the same way that one of the political sort of market makers, Jeffrey Epstein, did with young women and girls. So there's the political budget, there's the political market, there's power being treated as a commodity, and then the third is your network and your intelligence and your knowledge. And again, observing how these intelligence operators function in places like Sudan and Yemen, and seeing how power is being treated by Jeffrey Epstein and the people around him, it's pretty much the same. It's cruder when it's cash in hand in a Sudanese negotiation, and the party boss is literally handing out banknotes. It's much more suffering in the Epstein program. Now, all politics has this transactional element, all influence markets, etc. It becomes a kleptocratic system. Becomes that when it overrules, trumps, if you like, the institutions, when it becomes the dominant logic. And this can happen because of a collapse in public revenues, as happened in the sub-Saharan African countries. When central authority collapses, as happened in Syria or Libya at the time of the Arab Spring, and the institutions were not there to regulate the political competition within those. So it became very much an auction in which militia, factions, like etc., or for sale. It can come back through technocratic rivalry, and I think actually this is in many ways what happened in Ukraine prior to in the descent into the internal crisis that ultimately led to the Russian invasion. Or it can happen with state capture, where you simply have private interests just capturing the state, just paying off enough of those in charge of a state to repurpose it for their own interests. Now, the worrying thing that I noticed, having monitored this process over the last 15, 20 years, happening in North Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, is I don't see an offering. I don't see how the instruments for negotiation, mediation, political settlements don't work where you don't have the resources to provide the public revenue for a real peace dividend to make the institutions work, to have people actually have a better life, and where the political market, that transactional system, is very well financed. There's a lot of political money coming in, and the price is very high, so supply and demand. And that's happened in many places through the intervention of very well-funded, very capable political operators like some of the Gulf states, like Russia. The reason why Russia, which has a GDP considerably smaller than Spain, is a world actor is because it has a political budget used very skillfully by the former head of the KGB, or the Russian intelligence service, I should say, the successor to the KGB, that was very skillful in precisely this type of intelligence politics. And I think this is why the democratic uprisings of the Arab Spring didn't work. The question was really not democracy versus authoritarianism. It was, is this an institutional system where people follow the rules, or is it a political market where political money and coalition and mafia politics actually got the sway? And we, as Democrats, sort of missed that other dynamic. And so I haven't seen many off-ramps in that regard. I think in order to get to grips with it, we need to look at finance. We need to look at how public, private, and especially political, and most particularly illicit finance is handling. This, I think, is the fount of the instability, the hollowing out of institutions that we see. And very last, which is, I think, the return of families, is very much related to this, because we see the collapse in public budgets in many of the most affected countries, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Ethiopia, etc. We see the weaponization of hunger as part of the instability that comes from this. And then in the wake of all of this, we have a normative collapse. So I'm afraid that's an injection of pessimism into what has been up to now rather more encouraging the optimistic conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Dewell. And last but not least, I'm honored to be joined by Rita Maria El Zaghloul, who serves as the director of High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People on behalf of Costa Rica, which is an intergovernmental coalition of more than 100 countries, advancing a global deal for nature and people with the central goal of protecting at least 30% of land and ocean by 2030. She has played a leading role in shaping the coalition's 30 by 30 initiative, working across governments and international institutions to translate biodiversity commitments into coordinated diplomatic action. Previously, she served as the coordinator for the High Ambition Coalition for Nature within Costa Rica's Ministry of Environment and Energy, and has been a counselor and advisor on international relations with Costa Rica's permanent mission to the United Nations. She holds a degree in international relations from the University of Latina Costa Rica and a master's degree in conflict, security, and development from King's College.
Thank you, Alejandro. Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you with such distinguished panelists. Contrary to Mauricio, it's my first time here, but it's really a pleasure to be here and be in this very rich discussion. I come after you, Professor, maybe with a bit more of optimism. I consider myself as quite an optimist person, and Back in 2015, I was based in New York at the United Nations. I'm working at the mission of Costa Rica. And I think 2015 was quite a historical year where we had the adoption of the of 2030 agenda, the SDGs, and then after that, the Paris Agreement. With the Paris Agreement, and I'm not sure everyone knows about this, but there was quite a strong coalition that was built by the Marshall Islands and several states that was pushing for the Paris Agreement to be quite ambitious and to be adopted. And so a few years after that, 5 countries, mainly Costa Rica, France, the United Arab Emirates, Grenada, and Finland came together in order to do something similar as that coalition, but in the realm of biodiversity. So back in 2019, we were preparing at that moment to adopt in 2020 what was for the biodiversity world the Paris Agreement, but was mainly the Colombian Final Global Biodiversity Agreement. And the aim of this coalition of those 5 countries, or the coalition of the willings that we now hear much more often, and referring to your point previously, Professor, about the PM of Canada in Davos a couple of weeks ago, he was mentioning the importance of those coalitions of the willings in his speech as well. And so those 5 countries came together, and mainly guided by science, that was really pushing for the target to be the adoption of a target that would at least protect 30% of our planet's land and 30% of our planet's ocean by 2030. If this is the first time that you're hearing this, of course, and I don't pretend, I'm not going to do as Mauricio, a test with all of you. If this is the first time that you're hearing about this, you wouldn't know that back in 2019, before the target was adopted, the number where we were at that point was 7% on ocean and 17% on land. And so at that moment, telling 2 countries, well, actually, we need to triple on ocean protection and double our land protection was something that really was out of the table. And when we started those conversations, and being completely honest, coming from a background more on security, I was drawn into or thrown into this biodiversity and conservation world, and I really needed to convince fellow diplomats on the importance of this issue. And many of the other diplomats, mainly from mega diverse countries, were telling me this is impossible. We won't be able to adopt a target that will be calling us to triple our ocean protection and duplicate our land protection. But as I mentioned before, I think I'm quite an optimistic person, and the conditions were good and in our favor at that moment. We started with 5 countries led by Costa Rica and France, and then a few years after, and we were hit with the pandemic, of course, which changed a bit the way that we worked. We had to do a lot of diplomatic outreach, virtual diplomatic outreach, a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of meetings between ministers, between technical teams, in order to make sure to convince others. And what we realized is that what was really needed at that point was the creation of spaces of trust. Because at the end of the day, what is the multilateral system? It's really a place where the different countries have their voices and have their vote, even if they're a small country or a big country. And their needs and their constraints are really heard. And so within the coalition, what we did was create that space of trust where countries from, be it Latin America or countries, small island developing states, or France, or Nigeria, or any country was able to share what their main constraints were. And so by the time we got to the negotiations, the official negotiations, where all the different diplomats and negotiators put their hat on of their countries and really are ready to really fight in those rooms, had already seen many of the faces in the room. And so instead of fighting with another country and looking at it as Costa Rica or looking at it as Nigeria, they were looking at it as other people, understanding where they were coming from. And so in those rooms of negotiations, we started having kind of a domino effect, where a country would say and would really call for the adoption of this target, and a country from Latin America was saying it, a country was repeating and sustaining that position, coming from Asia, from Africa, from all of the different continents. And really the regular structure of the United Nations was a bit breaking down. We weren't negotiating as GRULAC, or weren't negotiating as the European Union, or weren't negotiating as Just Hands, or any other African Union or any other grouping, they were negotiating as really with one single goal. And by the end of the negotiations, what seemed like something that was impossible, we got to over 100 countries that were joining the coalition, and the target was adopted. And I think that was quite a big achievement, and one of the, I would say, one of the highlights of my life so far, really seeing how different countries were able to come together, but also not only coming together just for the sake of coming together and just because 30 by 30 is a catchy kind of number. They came together based on science. They came together including indigenous peoples and local communities, because there were spaces that were created in order to be able to have those conversations. And they came together with the NGOs. And I think in conclusion, for me, it's the multilateral system is of course changing and adapting. But I think beyond that, we have to see it as a place where we're really building trust. And how do we go beyond the different divisions that we have at the moment? And I think it's creating those type of spaces, creating those type of small structures that would support, not replace, but really support our multilateral system that we have built for so many years. And just to mention that as a joke afterwards, there was a proliferation of different hacks, because the High Emission Coalition, and I completely forgot to go through my presentation, because I usually never go through the presentation, but the High Emission Coalition for Nature and People, this was the one that was mainly focusing on 30 by 30. But if you go now and you type HAC or High Emission Coalition, you'll find High Emission Coalition for Plastics Treaty, you'll find a High Emission Coalition for the High Seas Treaty, you'll find a High Emission Coalition for the Climate Change, which was the first one, the original one. And so I think what this created was really an avalanche of a lot of work that was done, but really spaces that created more trust. So by the time that we went into negotiations, we were able to really rely on our multilateral system, but really from a space of trust and understanding of each other. So I'll leave you there. Maybe I'll just put one slide that for me, I don't think you can see it, but just because we're talking about biodiversity, and many times people say, well, how come we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about security, and many times biodiversity and conservation is really put on the back burner, and not many people look into it. And even me, coming from the world of peace and security, I never kind of, biodiversity or conservation was never in the front of my thinking. But only a couple of weeks ago, back in Davos, this report was launched. And mainly what it mentions is, if we look into the short term, the biodiversity risk is really one of the last ones. But if we look into the long term, biodiversity loss is number 2. And so I would just urge you to look into this issue, because it will impact us, and I can talk a little bit more about that interconnectivity with other crises that we will be facing in the future and other risks. With that, I hope I brought a bit of optimism, and very happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you all truly so much for these thoughtful remarks. I would like to begin our discussion with just a couple questions for all of you. We welcome any of you to begin the conversation as it fits, and we want more so foster dialogue between all of us and create a conversation. I'm really glad from all of these remarks, because I think there's a balance and to a degree a very big diversity in the way that we are kind of framing right now the global order. As the panel says, could it be hollow, as Brent mentioned, maybe half full, half empty, unstable, maybe prone to geocryptocracy as we've spoken, maybe in a way that it's in a facade or it's like crumbling, or also that it's in the making and in showing progress in some areas. In some areas, it's also faltering. But what I would like to ask is, how should we interpret this particular current moment for international institutions? Perhaps as a period of structural weakening, cyclical consultation, institutional transformation. Perhaps it's something that we're just seeing strain more and more until there's something new that's coming along, or we're in the process of building into something from this. And also, what distinguishes this moment, if anything, from earlier periods of strain in the global order? Because as we spoke, spoken before, there are patterns in the way that these institutions kind of falter and reinvent themselves. But what distinguishes this moment, and where are we headed to, based on what the current landscape is? And I encourage anyone to start as they see fit.
Since I'm at the end of the table, I'll start. I really appreciated all of the talks, and I think one of the things that I heard in some of the remarks was the importance of people being together and trust. And Alex spoke about the dominant logic, and I think a dominant logic is something that people have embraced and believe in and construct their own personalities and goals around. And I think what we see at the moment is a kind of abuse of the order that was built, that post-World War II order, a kind of hacking for illiberal purposes of the liberal international order. And, you know, I'm a lawyer, and we try to think of constitutional rules and ways of policing things, but the fundamental problem is belief and the way people think about this order, the way they develop a fidelity to it. And I think that's in danger of being reversed, at least in part. And so I think that's one of the concerns of this moment.
I think we're on the issue of peace and the United Nations. We're at a very interesting moment. So today there were two events. One was a big event with President Trump's board of peace with his I would call them autocrats and kleptocrats, which is, I mean, is really the distillation of that geokleptocratic logic. It's a pay-to-play institution, you know, with Trump as chairman for life. You know, if you give $1 billion, you can be on board for indefinitely, permanently. And I suspect it will be one of those institutions that actually will not be as permanent as his chair would like. And then there was so the first target for the Board of Peace is Gaza, but they're also talking about Sudan. And the reason why they want Sudan there is I think they want to launder their reputation. They want to say, okay, here's a conflict everyone thinks is bad. They're no good guys. You know, they're no good bad. Everyone's bad. If we can fix Sudan, and you know, some of the members of the Board of Peace, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, you know, Turkey, Qatar, are all there. Then this will can put a different gloss on the Board of Peace. But Trump's envoy, Massad Boulos, went to brief the UN Security Council today. And if you listen to what he said, he ended up actually, for 90% of what he was saying, actually giving very, very conventional talking points, as though he was talking to the UN Security Council 10, 20, 30 years ago, talking about human rights, peace, humanitarian needs, etc. And I think the reason is that is a very straightforward one, which is that in their attempts to deal with this complex problem of Sudan, using this the mixture of populist grandstanding and kleptocratic logic, they realize it ain't going to work. And so they actually have to come back to an institution that, for all its shortcomings and problems, actually has a track record of delivering what people wanted, which is a multilateral system, not just the UN, but the African Union and others too.
Yes, really thinking more about, if we're talking more about the UN itself and the institutions, I would say that the issue is that when the UN was created mainly to prevent conflict. And that kind of developed and kind of shifted more towards a complex global system where it handles everything. And I mean, from climate change all the way to peace and security issues, developments, etc. And so I think rather than saying that there's a structural, we're going through a structural weakening, I would say that we're going through a transformation. And it's a transformation of our multilateral system in order to be able to face what is needed to be faced at this moment. So I would say, I mean, concretely to that question, that I wouldn't see it more of a weakening. I would see it as a complete reconstruction and a way of really evolving and transforming the multilateral system to our current need of this moment, not the need that we had back in 1940.
I agree with everything Rita just said, and besides transformation, we have to acknowledge also that because of funding cuts, the UN internally is going through a big reform process, UN 80 for the UN's 80th anniversary. And, you know, when I read about some of the proposals being put forward, I didn't want to say this to some of my colleagues, but then, or former colleagues, but then when I started telling them, they were agreeing with me. A lot of those reforms were probably necessary. There's a lot of duplication, right? There's a lot of inefficiency in the UN system, and perhaps, you know, right now might be a moment to stop and think about how to make delivery on the ground more effective. And I don't mean I love these funding cuts, of course, but you know, I think it is a moment for the UN to start a process of internal reflection. So there's that institutional transformation happening internally also. So it's not just like among member states, but also internally. And I think it's interesting that this board of peace, you know, it's starting with Gaza, as Professor Naval said. And what did the U.S. put a lot of diplomatic effort into making happen? For this Gaza peace plan to be supported by the UN Security Council. You know, instead of bypassing the Security Council, Ambassador Mike Waltz worked really hard in New York to lobby the 15 council members to vote in favor or at least abstain on the resolution about the Gaza peace plan. Similarly to what the Bush administration did with the Iraq war and what the Clinton administration did with the Kosovo intervention. So, you know, I think it's worth keeping in mind that, you know, there's always this attempt at getting legitimacy from the UN because, again, it's the only truly global institution. And, you know, we heard a lot about this speech from the Prime Minister of Canada. And when I was reading it, I thought, interesting, you know, people talk about the superpowers, now he's talking about the middle powers. Most of the world is actually small powers, I guess, or smaller states. And Rita will probably agree with me. Those are the people who care the most about the UN. Because, you know, for countries like Singapore, like Costa Rica, like Jordan, like Liechtenstein, et cetera, the small and developing states, you know, the UN is the only forum where they have a right to speak, just as the other, you know, everyone else has. So just to say that in this moment of Alejandro asked what distinguishes this moment. One thing I find more and more is how much small states really appreciate and defend the multilateral, the liberal international order. And you know, it's interesting because many of those states are not necessarily democracies, but they, you know, they support the UN wholeheartedly.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to shift the conversation, along those lines to talk about, we spoke about the Board of Peace briefly, and how UN and other international forums actually give space to conversations that are much needed. But how are emerging regional arrangements and informal networks interacting with these formal multilateral institutions, and what does the future of international multilateral institutions look like in the wake of these emerging regional coalitions and informal networks?
So I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. One thing that many people may not know is that the UN Security Council has yearly, annual meetings or briefings with the African Union, with the European Union, with the OSCE, the League of Arab States, the the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, etc., etc. So again, there's always this legitimacy that's given to the UN and to the Security Council just from the fact that all these regional arrangements, are looking for the space to interact with Security Council members and with the UN. So I just don't think that they're mutually exclusive, and a lot of these conversations at least start within a UN framework, like the High Ambition Coalition. Yes, there are some exceptions, but I think regional arrangements, ad hoc arrangements, have a lot of potential, and the UN is a good place for those conversations to at least start.
Maybe I would add to that point that I think it's not really replacing the formal multilateral system and institutions, as I was mentioning before. It's really creating spaces that are a bit more flexible, more adaptive, that include additional actors. And then by the time that we get that there are official processes that take place and within the UN system, then we're arriving with a much more robust kind of discussion, and the creation or the proliferation, as I was mentioning before, of those different coalitions working beside those multilateral system. It's really a matter of seeing it how we can strengthen our multilateral system and really to strengthen the ambition on doing it. And I think it should not be seen as something that goes separately, but actually really reinforcing and modernizing the multilateral system.
There was one innovation in the last round of the process of electing the Secretary Generals, which I think something could really be built upon, which is a public forum in which the candidates actually engaged with the general public. And this never happened before. This was always, the vote was always just among member states, and the process was always secretive. And I think one thing that could and should be pressed for by citizens, taxpayers, because after all we are those who own the UN and pay for it, is that all the senior positions that are up for election in some way by member states should have this process where the top candidates should answer questions from constituents from the general public, and I think that would go quite a way to injecting a bit of energy and some legitimacy in the public mind to the organisation like speech.
If we think about a country like the United States or a governmental type entity like the European Union, I don't think we would say that government in those contexts should be mostly informal or mostly regional. I think we would say, well, we need some hard law, not always, sometimes we need hard law. There's a space for informal rules and norms. And we would also say there are times when we want to act federally or throughout the region. And if we think about things like artificial intelligence or climate change, those are really global problems. And biodiversity, and we can come up with others that have global aspects. And one global aspect is that states might compete, and they could have a race to the bottom, and it might be useful to figure out at what level do we need to centralize to be effective in these areas. So, in the World Trade Organization, we're dealing with trade and tariffs and other barriers. A lot of those really have to be done on a multilateral basis. They make sense to be done on a multilateral basis. We have a lot of regional agreements in trade, and they liberalize more. There was a debate 30 years ago about whether they were stumbling blocks or building blocks towards multilateral trade liberalization, and there are different ways to look at it. They certainly are places where we can experiment on important trade-related issues, like climate, like other environmental issues, like labor, like gender, all sorts of issues that need to be addressed at the same time that you address trade. This was the experience of the United States Federation and the experience of the European Union Federation. And so at some level, you need multilateral action. And I would also say at some level, and it was the concept that was developed in the European Union based on Catholic social doctrine of subsidiarity, of governing at the right level. One way of thinking about that is what's the most efficient level at which to govern. Calls for governmentality at different levels, including at the multilateral level. And the concern that I started with, which is a kind of disappointment that we can't do more at the multilateral level. And I think that's a failure of governmentality, the ability to legislate, have majority voting, maybe even without sovereign equality. I apologize to those who are small states. But as you develop those things in the European Union, you had to depart from sovereign equality. And so we need a constitutional moment. We may be at a constitutional moment where our existing institutions aren't doing the job we need them to do. And we have to think, what institutions could we develop that would answer today's needs? As others would say. Thank you.
I am going to pose one last question, and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A. It's a little bit along the lines of what you just talked about, Professor Trachtman, which is I personally am very intrigued by the WTO because it is one, I mean, it is widely regarded as having a lot of effect, as you said, and being effective in its promises. And it was actually also anchored in national law. My question maybe if you can start by answering this. My question is, was it always doomed to, dare I say, crumble in the way that it has? And is the way that it worked or didn't work, is that a way to look at future international institutions in the legal sense?
Thank you. It's hard to know whether it was always doomed and whether it's doomed today. I used to say that if you burned the WTO to the ground, you would just have to rebuild it because a lot of its rules and even its institutional capacities answer real-world problems. They allow us to act. Barney Frank, former congressman from Massachusetts, said, "Government is the name we give to the things we do together." And the WTO was a thing we do together to, it's an economic concept, but to make things more efficient so that we are all wealthier. Again, with distributional questions and problems, but it creates wealth. It has created wealth. So I don't think it was doomed. What I think has challenged it is a kind of imbalance. And it's a long story, but I'll try to tell it very, very briefly. And that is that it was created in 1995, and it hasn't really been revised for these 30-odd years. And a lot of things have changed, and there are a lot of needs, and it was limited then. And so we need to fix it, but the way we make treaties is voluntary. And it's hard to get states to agree, and powerful states that are wealthy like the United States and India and China, especially China, stand back and say, I don't want to make any changes. China especially has said, I'm happy with the original WTO. I don't want to renegotiate. And part of the crisis that we've been experiencing kernel of truth in the United States position is that the system needs to change, it needs to be fixed in important ways, and other states are refusing to do it. And the United States is refusing to do it. I don't want to make the United States into the hero of this story. But I think its doom is a result of its inability to evolve as currently structured.
I can talk about the WTO, but I want to pick up on a few of those points. So about a month ago, a friend of mine was saying, you know, what we need in the world is we need international institutions to have more power, for the UN to have more power. And he looks at me, right? And I'm like, oh, no way. I do not want the UN to have more power. Why? Because again, my conception of the United Nations is that it is a table. It's where member states sit around and, you know, what we do together, as you said. What you mentioned about governmentality, you know, when my friend, the conspiracy theorist that thinks the UN is running the world, he's like, it's global government. And I always tell him, no, it's not global government. And I would never want it to be a global government. You know, we have international law and we have treaties and they're negotiated in multilateral frameworks. But yes, our institutions need to evolve. And the charter hasn't been revised substantially since 1945. The U.S. Constitution hasn't been revised except for the amendments, but you know, there's some very basic structures since 1789 or I don't know when. But a lot of that endures, and I have there's some people who are calling for a conference to review the UN Charter, and I would be so scared of opening up the Charter right now at this moment. So yeah, I think I'm always kind of careful at telling people, you know, and this friend of mine was really surprised, you know, how can someone who's, you know, whose heart beats UN blue be saying that he doesn't want the UN to have more power? And I'm completely convinced by that.
If I may, I want to ask just one last question from our end, because I really want to know from each one of you your perspectives, your expertise, your areas, be it the WTO as you spoke, the UN, regional or coalitions such as the High Mission Coalition. What is the key of resilience as we're speaking about this conference? The resilience of the current global order. We don't want it to crumble and just like be destroyed to catastrophe. Where does the resilience lie? I know you mentioned about the key of the creation being inclusion, trust. So where does the resilience looking forward lie in each and all of these areas of the global order?
I guess I'll pick up on what Professor Trachtman just said. You know, if you burn the WTO to the ground, then you will end up rebuilding. And same with the UN. You know, and part of that is because member states have realized that it's better to talk, that it's better to work together, and that's the resilience of the international order. It's that so many crises, so many issues have been resolved through multilateralism, and that most states think right now, or I would say nearly all states think right now, that at the very least we need spaces to talk and to negotiate. And I think that's what makes the multilateral system resilient, but you know, evolving, transforming, and adapting.
I think there's a deep set of shared norms, of sentiments, not always very well articulated, about some things that are simply wrong and simply shouldn't happen. Starving children is wrong, for example. And I think there is such a groundswell of popular revulsion against the impunity that those in power seek to bestow upon themselves. If the UN were to be burned to the ground, something very similar would have to be constructed. Same with the international courts, especially the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, maybe I will just add to that I think it's also about continuing to believe in a more global common kind of north. Because when we move more towards a world of fragmentation and looking inwards as countries are fragmented, then we would be much more isolated and not creating those spaces that I was mentioning before of inclusivity, dialogue, trust, would lead us to a very different place. So I think resilience is really trying to think beyond the point of history where we're at now. How can we, because we will be faced with many issues and many crises that will be coming our way that are not only limited to our own national limits. We will be faced with issues that are much bigger, as climate change, as AI, as biodiversity loss and collapse, as many migration. We can talk about many other crises that we might be facing. So it's more an issue about how can we look beyond our own nations and look into this greater kind of a more common goal towards toward the upcoming years and what we will be facing as an international community.
All of the above. I think it's resilience involves adaptability and the ability to make changes as circumstances change or as we recognize errors. But I think, as has already been said, a kind of solidarity, a sense of shared destiny that is growing culturally in the world. Trust in the sense that we believe that others share that solidarity and are willing to act in good faith. And we still have fear, and fear that others won't act in good faith, and that's why we can't enter into institutions with others. So we need to build that kind of trust, which involves liberalism, which involves accepting rules where your ideas might be rejected, where the goals you have or I have might not be successful, but that that will overall be better. And I think, you know, I spoke to some former diplomats, some active diplomats, former diplomats about reform at the WTO governance. And one, a former ambassador said, if I went home to my capital and said something had been agreed at the World Trade Organization without my state's agreement, I'd be fired immediately. And we don't have that in national legislatures. And as I mentioned, the European Union started with no majority voting, with an uncertain constitutionality. And as a matter of institutional adaptation to answer questions as they came up, functionalism, as the political scientists call it, they adapted. Now, lots of imperfections, but they adapted and developed a system that did respond to their needs. And we can tell the same story about the United States federal system and about every other system that came from smaller parts and developed into larger entities or larger shared entities. I'm thinking about the federal system, shared rulemaking. So, so that's, I think, resilience comes from being open-minded, I think, to institutional change as it becomes necessary.
Thank you once again to all of our panelists for the discussion. I would like to ask for a round of applause. So now we'd like to open up the floor for some questions. When you do, please, I will hand out the microphone and briefly introduce yourself and direct your question to either one or multiple panelists.
Good evening. My name is Elena Batura. I'm a political scientist First of all, thank you for a fantastic panel, and thank you to the students who organized this fantastic event. So my question is to Rita, if I may. You mentioned, and maybe you didn't mean it that way, but I understood it that way, that there may be a certain priority ranking of issues where security perhaps may be ranked higher than biodiversity and conservation. So I would like you to explain more about the urgency and importance of biodiversity and conservation and how it's interconnected, as you said, with other challenges. And a question to Alex, if I may. So I understand that kleptocracy doesn't stop at national borders, and that corrupting influence of mafia politics extends beyond the places where politics is broken to places that still have functioning institutions like established democratic societies, where kleptocracy emanating from elsewhere corrodes those institutions. So how can more established functioning democratic societies protect themselves from the corrosive influence of global kleptocracy? And could you maybe speak to the role of enablers of kleptocracy that are based in democratic societies?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elena. Excellent question, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss and share a bit more about why it's so important to talk about conservation in particular. And I think many times when we talk about the different crises, we see them as separate crises, right? We talk about we talk about migration, we talk about food security, we talk about climate change, but we don't see them as interconnected. And part of the elements that I think is very key within conservation is that it's quite connected with many of those issues. So in particular, and I'll just mention a couple of that interconnectedness. Only ocean absorbs 25% of CO2 emissions and 90% of the excess heat in global warming. So if we do not protect our ocean, we would not be able to also solve our climate crisis. Food security. And we have more than 3 billion people that rely on the food that's coming from the protein that's coming from the ocean, our fish stocks. So if we do not protect our ocean, and if we do not have concrete and high protected areas, we won't have the fish stock being restored, and we won't be able to provide that food security for our people. Global equity and for future generations, for example, that could be also connected. So I think everything I'm saying is just to mention that in a way, it's not really about putting and ranking the different issues that we have. As I was mentioning before, it's looking into our issues in a multi-dimensional way. And I think that's part of the complexity of DBN, that it started being very kind of concrete on that very core goal of not going through evading another world war, and then it became much bigger and with much more multi-dimensional issues. So I think what we need to be able to see, and now we have been trying to look into the 30 by 30 or the protection of at least 30% of our planet's land from now until 2030, is really how it is interconnected with other crises. How reaching that protection in 2030 would actually help us within food security, within national security, with migration, making sure that we don't have population that are migrating to other countries because of the lack of resources that we have, because of the lack of fish stocks that we have, because of those different kind of complexities that they will be facing. So what I would invite you is just to see it more of in a term of that multidimensional and interconnected way, and not isolated. I think that's part of the problem that we face, that many times we look into those issues in a very kind of divisive way. And from the coalition, what we're trying to do is really trying to see those interconnection with the other crises.
So, in answer to your first question, I think a great example today, which is the British police taking Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, former prince, into custody, and the reason, the specific reason being abuse of public office. because he was sharing, while he was a trade envoy, he was sharing confidential trade information through Jeffrey Epstein with others. And I think the courts and the police and exposing, you know, people like him, which goes right to the top, I think is exactly one way in which this, you know, this ought to be protected. How a functioning democratic society should protect itself. And who are the enablers? Well, the enablers include, you know, tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions. And the US Treasury has all the instruments it needs if it wants to track that money. It just isn't doing it. You know, in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2009, and the surge, the 25% surge in hidden wealth in tax havens, the OECD countries then made a push for transparency, saying that you know, each of those tax havens should have a bilateral transparency treaty. Well, it had no effect because the money was just moved to the non-compliant places, and there was no effort by the US Treasury, which is really the key in this to try and track that money. So you know, I think that should be on the agenda for any, if there were to be a democratic administration, empowering the Treasury to use those financial tools that it uses against terrorists and against international criminal criminals, against those illicit financial flows. Citizens United is an example, also terrible example of the enabling of you know, secret political jurisdiction, political payments, cryptocurrency as well is perhaps the most shocking example at the moment. And then we have the cowardice of the media, Washington Post being the prime example, just capitulating, abandoning its storied tradition of investigative journalism in order to its owner to fall in line with the demands of the current administration.
And yeah, I think we have a question up there, please.
Yes, thank you again to all the panelists. My name is David Monge, and I'm a second year master's student at Fletcher School. And one thing I wanted to ask about was, we talked a lot about these very large organizations such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, many of the big players in sort of the field of what we call the liberal international order or international law. And what I wanted to ask, and Trachtman and Professor Wall, was about the future of things like non-governmental organizations, and essentially that these are institutions, and all the panelists can address it to the best of their ability. What are the future of these smaller actors that mainly rely on things like private funding and donations, either from you know, wealthy actors or from other societies that play, what their role is in the future of this wavering international order? Thank you.
So I think it's an interesting moment for the NGOs because 40 years ago when I started my career, most of the NGOs, especially the European ones, were very small, were voluntary, didn't rely on government money, didn't rely on big philanthropic donors. Here in the United States, slightly less so. And over decades, I think the NGO sector got very comfortable with government money and with big philanthropic money. And what's happening at the moment is suddenly they realize that they shouldn't have been relying on. And I think we will see a reinvigoration of the more grassroots efforts in the NGO sector, and I think more energetic, more lively as a result.
I think that NGOs can play a very productive role. There are also dangers with NGOs, as you suggested. They've been active in climate change, biodiversity, all sorts of sustainability areas in norm development. There's a diversity of norms. I sometimes have worked on food standards. And for a farmer in a developing country, there might be diverse NGO-based food standards or store-based food standards that makes it very difficult to comply. But they certainly have a role, and one of the things that they can do usefully is apply specialized expertise. And you know, they're lobbyists. They might be lobbyists for good faith and good goals. There's a dark side where they could be lobbyists for special interests that you and I or I disagree with, and I'd rather not have them. So I think they play a role in any kind of political system, but they can't because they're not democratically accountable. They can't be given the kind of power that governments have.
Maybe I would just add that they're going also through some transformation, because as we saw last year, there was a lot of cuts, and so that kind of prompted them to do a lot of changes. And there's a lot of shift also between the NGOs, the more global NGOs that we know of, and much more of the local NGOs. And I see more a trend of that strengthening more of the local NGOs, and that knowledge being kept at local level instead of coming and top-down approach, being more not precisely a bottom-up approach, but really a local expertise that would be more prominent, I think, as we move forward. So there is, I would say, same as what we have been discussing before, but there is a shift and adaptability that they will need to go through, and working closer from our side with conservation NGOs, we've seen that shift coming, and the fact that it has impacted heavily a lot of large NGO and smaller ones. But I do think that we will be seeing more of that shift and more of that focus on that local level.
So NGOs also, I think, suffer from a phenomenon that also happens within the UN system, which is turf battles, and once competition for resources. And now that I'm working in Costa Rica more on the civic participation side, for example, there were several organizations who were working on increasing voter turnout for our recent election. From when I was leading one of those efforts, and when I heard that some of the others were doing that, my immediate reaction was to reach out to them and let's work together. And everyone ended up being really happy. That's not the case usually. There's a lot of competition, there's a lot of egos, there's a lot of turf battles, and I think it's important to have humility, especially from international NGOs, because no one, people in the global south or marginalized areas or whatever, there's nothing worse than coming in with a quick fix or with a sort of arrogance. So yeah, I think NGOs should have humility, have a spirit of working together, and yeah, I of course I believe in the role that civil society organizations can play in everything. But sometimes it seems like everyone is just, I'm going to start my own NGO. And that proliferation might be a bit problematic.
Hi, I'm Nina Shawaf. I'm a Syrian journalist. I'm now a visitor following just my question to Alex and maybe Joel, because you talk about Syria and the NGO. I have been leading non-profit organizations since the beginning of the revolution, if I can call it revolution, the beginning of the revolution. And all my work is with international fund and, of course, local fund. And the problem now, for example, after we said that we finished the revolution and Assad fall or escape, 14 years, all this killing and torturing and fighting for democracy and freedom we back from the beginning with our like civil society organization and the NGO, unfortunately. And the International Political Fund, as you said, Alex, it's always it's directing something, you know, it's targeting something. And I don't know how we will be able to have a lesson learned after 14 years. I'm asking about here because I'm Syrian and I have been working in this field. How we can like really directing the political money that enter the NGO really to build the country. And after 14 years, we back to the beginning. The mentality is the same. We could not, after all this training, all capacity building that we have been doing for 14 years, and it's really a mess now in Syria. So my question, what can we do?
I wish I could give you an answer. I mean, Ramadan Karim, and really, I mean, the depth of the devastation, fragmentation, bewilderment, trauma, etc. In Syria is something that I really struggle to actually to comprehend. And I really don't think I can. I think your question actually, in a way, answers itself. I can't do justice to the scope and depth of your question.
Maybe hope.
I have less capability than Alex.
Sorry about that. I believe we had one more question.
Hi, my name is Isa. I'm an environmental policy master's student. And I guess my question is, especially with some of the environmental agreements, many of the bigger multinational agreements that the UN or other multinational bodies do, they're very good kind of coordinating on this high level, but a lot of the work to actually get things done needs to be done on the ground at a local level, as Rita implied. Just saying that, like, the project needs to be built locally, it's not built on the multinational level to actually reduce emissions or climate adaptation. And from my professional experience, I've seen kind of major gaps between how that funding and how those big agreements are structured versus the realities of getting that done. And how do you see that the UN kind of took Professor Trachtman's point about having multiple levels of government, how they coordinate better? How do you see the UN system, or just the international system in general, coordinating better from the big agreement down to getting a project done and kind of all the levels in between, so that groups work together and it's better synchronized in their mission and goal, both funding and also just effort points? It could be for anyone if you want to say much more. Thanks.
I guess it's an excellent question and one that we really struggle a lot with, because now that we have the target agreed, as I was mentioning, on specifically the very target within the framework of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. One thing is to have the international agreement, the framework at more on international level. Another is to kind of bring it more to the national circumstances and go more into that implementation at national level. I think I would say it's a tough question, but what we have seen that kind of works, and we've been trying from the coalition side to really push governments to do that, is go through processes that are national processes that are multi-stakeholder processes, involving civil society, indigenous peoples and local communities, different ministries, not only ministries of environment and of natural resources, but really trying to get other ministries to be involved, because it's not only an environmental issue, it's also an issue that we will need to coordinate with the finance ministry and with other ministries, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc. So I think the avenue for that would be to that multi-layered kind of approach. Is one of the avenues could be doing more of that type of approach, more on that national level. And I think the regional element is also quite strong. What we've seen, for example, more specifically with the work that we've been doing, is when we have regions that focus on doing joint work. So, for example, ECOWAS countries working together on looking into the issue of implementation of 30 by 30 as a region, that helps a lot to kind of translate that, international framework into more of the regional and then the local, the national and then the local level. So that's how I would respond to that question. But it is a long process, and part of the complexity is that we have pressing time, not a lot of time in order to be able to do those processes. And usually doing this type of opening that type of space, doing this type of inclusive processes takes time. It doesn't happen in a month. It needs to take longer time. So we face that kind of that balance between making sure that we have those processes at regional level, national level, local level, but at the same time being able to move sufficiently quickly in order to really tackle the issue that we have at hand. So that would be my response. Of course, it's a very difficult question that we all face.
So I think a fundamental question about a lot of the things that need to be done, they need to be done at multiple levels of government, and as Rita suggested earlier, they're all multifunctional. So they all involve different areas of government or expertise or responsibility. And so it's a daunting problem. I have tried to understand that problem, and actually in this project I've been working on, we consulted, we spoke to a group of consultants who work on leadership for large-scale social change. And the two insights that I took on board from those folks were first, working on distributed leadership, identifying, maybe you call them nodes or just groups that are working on pieces of the puzzle, and then having a platform for coordination of that work on those pieces of the puzzle, and then we're focusing on cascading action. So, and you know this better than I do, but sequencing your efforts and making sure they're working in a way that has the ability to build on earlier initiatives. So it takes a lot of planning and a lot of coordination, and I'm not sure how you do it beyond saying what I've just said.
I wanted to pick up on your question, Lina, and I agree with everything that both professors said. I think it's so daunting, and I think I have to begin by saying, how much solidarity I feel. I think we all feel for Syria, for the country, for the Syrian people. And I think we have to have a lot of humility, and and I think that's a humility that the international community and international organizations have right now after a lot of failed experiments in state building or state rebuilding. I can't think of any harder task in the world than trying to build or rebuild state authority. But two things, and again, I say this with a lot of humility and also with not a great understanding of the Syrian context, but just two ideas that might make sense to you or not. One is the importance of local level governance and helping to build and rebuild municipal or departmental, I'm not sure what the administrative division is in Syria, but sometimes, like in Somalia, where I worked for a year, there was a lot of emphasis on like writing the constitution and a lot of things at the federal level. But there was also an effort on more decentralization, like helping the federal states of Somalia to develop their own systems of governance and also at the municipal level. So I think it's also, it's important to also strengthen those local systems of governance. And then the issue of reconciliation, national reconciliation. I've seen two examples, and the Balkans is not a country, so it's not a super relevant example, but there wasn't really ever a concerted effort for reconciliation in the Balkans. And you see the effects today because, you go to Dubrovnik, and they will tell you how much they hate the Serbians and the Montenegrins, and then you go to Mostar, and they'll tell you how much they hate the Croatians, etc., etc. There was never really an effort at reconciliation. And then in Colombia, where the peace agreement included a really robust system called the Comprehensive System of Truth, Justice, reparations, and non-repetition. So, yeah. And I've seen how in Colombia this really how much resources have been invested in promoting national reconciliation has been so key to the country being able to move forward. So I think investing in reconciliation is also very important.
I think that if we have, we have one. Okay, please keep it very brief. Thank you.
I'm just really bothered by the question about how we can address plutocracy. It seems like the presentation suggested that that there is no off-ramp for some of the countries that are caught in this transactional politics dynamics. But it just seems like we probably cannot be very effective at addressing complex global problems, the international and national levels, if at the national level and globally the politics is governed by pure transactional interests rather than any sort of public good. So it just seems like it's very key to find a way to address and change the dynamics of this transactional politics. So do you have maybe any initial suggestions?
The fundamental formula is the state building formula, which is you need to have sound public finance. You need to have a long-term time horizon for those in power, so that the temptations of short-term predation or corruption are lessened, and a strong set of institutions to constrain that type of political behavior. And so all those things need to be done. It's remarkably difficult where you have so much both instability and uncertainty about the future, and so much dark money circulating. So it needs to be addressed from various different directions.
So with that, I would like to conclude the conversation with an ask, especially sitting in a university, to all students. I think a lot of us are concerned about our future, concerned about growing multipolarity, concerned about the future of global governance as it is. But with that in mind, I want you to remember that you are active players in this, and you have the power to shape the future of what you perceive to be global governance. We've heard a broad range of ideas, from norms in international law, from keeping the UN as a space for conversations of member states, from regional intergovernmental groups like the High Ambition Coalition and the idea of kleptocracy. But I want everyone to remember to stay creative, that you are actively able to shape the future of global governance. And as students, I think that this is the time to dive into these issues, put in the work, and to stay creative in all ways that you possibly can.
With that, I would like to just sincerely thank all our panelists for this amazing participation and this amazing conversation, and thank you all for being part of this as well. So, a round of applause for you guys.
Thank you.